Good evening and welcome to the Art and Technology Lectures. My name is Mark Tribe. I'm the Director of Art and Technology here at the School of the Arts. At the School of the Arts today, technology is at best seen as a way of solving artistic problems, at worst as a problem to be solved. But there's an entire field of artistic practice that has been largely unexplored here to date, a field where technologies and the social, political, and economic forces that shape them become themselves objects of experimental inquiry. The purpose of this lecture series is to develop a critical understanding of art and technology as an interdisciplinary field that has tremendous importance and relevance to the more traditional domains of artistic practice that we work with here. Tonight I'd like to welcome our second speaker in the series, Chris Csikszentmihalyi. Chris is the Fukutake Assistant Professor of Media Arts and Sciences at the MIT Media Lab, where he directs the Computing Culture Group, a group that does, I think, really interesting work. We invited Chris to speak tonight not only because he's a terrific artist, and we'll see some of his work, but also because he has a particularly sophisticated and informed perspective on science and technology. And we hope you'll join us for our upcoming lectures. Wednesday, March 24th, we'll have Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky, here in this room, unless we announce a change of venue. We're looking for possibly a different venue for that with better acoustics. Thursday, April 8th, Manuel de Landa, who's a Deleuzian philosopher, just wrote a book that sort of elucidates Deleuze for scientists. And the last one, Wednesday, May 12th, Ricardo Dominguez, hacktivist and tactical media artist. So please join me in welcoming Chris Csikszentmihalyi.
Thanks so much, Mark. This isn't what I'm going to be talking about, but I will describe it a little bit. It's great to be here to be helping Mark kind of initiate this new program. I first met Mark, or I didn't meet him, but he sent me an email asking if I would be a West Coast kind of correspondent for Rhizome, and I was like, I don't think I have time. And so then Lev Manovich did it, and look what's happened to his career, so I regret that ever since. Basically, I've ended up now after a Bachelor in Fine Arts and a Master of Fine Arts teaching at MIT and running a research group at the MIT Media Lab. And this is what's called a DARPA quad chart. DARPA is the agency, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, that funds a lot of kind of advanced military work. The Predator unmanned drones, for instance, were developed. The internet was developed by DARPA as well as a way to reduce the threat to American information systems in nuclear war. So, if Chicago and Toledo were taken out, we'd still be able to route from DC to Seattle. So DARPA is consistently doing a lot of very, very exciting work in kind of military technologies. And the coin of the realm in most science institutions, like the one where I'm teaching, is a DARPA grant, because DARPA grants are notoriously more loose money than other kinds of grants like National Science Foundation or some of the other agencies. So when I had my presentation to the faculty at our summer retreat at the Media Lab, I was asked to present my work in the form of a DARPA quad chart. Now, with an MFA from UC San Diego, having been a terminal artist my whole life, there's no way that I could ever get a DARPA grant, and especially not after some of my more recent work that you'll be seeing later. So I thought that was really funny, and of course I've never had to express my ideas in a way like this. And so for instance, this is the impact quadrant. Those are the new ideas, and I was told by Professor Joe Jacobson, who does really amazing work. He does, for instance, these like little collars that you can fit around your RNA to keep them from producing protein unless you press a button in your pocket that's like a garage door opener, in which case the collars get bigger and suddenly the proteins can be created. So he's doing really amazing stuff. But so he said you have to have at least 3 completely new ideas. And I was like, well, you know, Joe, I mean, my education, I kind of tend to believe that there are no completely new ideas, you know, but rather that there's, you know, history and you know, culture that helps determine new ideas, and that these things are kind of, you know, I can't really pull those out. And he was like, no, they have to be completely new ideas. And then later, like, I had done some stuff down here, and he said, oh, that's not good. That's the quantification. You know, the impacts, they have to be quantifiable. You have to make DARPA a promise about quantification that you meet. And I was like, I don't know any artists who quantify their work that way. You know, he was like, no, has to be quantified. So this is what I came up with. You know, there are no completely new ideas. Technology is power. We're researching who uses technology and for what is that missing. And of course, you know, I promised to make the world 120% safer. So, so that's actually, yeah, I guess that's a pretty good description of the goal of our research, is to make the world about 120% safer. I'll show, this is kind of one of the, I've done lectures of small sections of my work in New York before, but never at Columbia, and I've never shown some of my earlier work. So I'm going to go back to about 1992 and show some of the stuff that I've been doing. But basically, you know, right now my research group, Computing Culture, is a research group where we're looking at two areas of technology, and we're looking specifically through the focus of what are science and engineering. You know, there's a lot of really phenomenal empirical work, a lot of really great ethnography of science right now that are showing that the traditional stories that scientists have told people about their work, or that philosophers of science, for instance, have told people about the work of science, are a little bit misleading. They tend to be oversimplifications, and you know, part of the two cultures debate between humanities and science is that those two areas really aren't speaking. So you have scientific explanation of how science gets done. You have sort of Kuhnian models or philosophy of science on the other side. Since the late 1970s, there have been some people from the humanities side who've been doing really exhaustive ethnographies of science, and that's you know, alternately called science and technology studies, or more specifically, sociology of scientific knowledge. And these are fields to which I've gone to try to understand a little bit about how science and engineering operate. And you know, what becomes really clear is that through the process of education at engineering schools and then graduate degrees or companies that engineers work in, it's a process of socialization. People like Susan Lee Starr and others have pointed out that process of socialization leads to a kind of an idea of the world, an idea of what's an interesting problem to solve. And so scientists and engineers, just like artists, go through this kind of socialization process and are more likely to be solving particular kinds of areas, building technologies to look at particular kinds of ideas. An example is that many artists work with ideas of surveillance because they're obsessed with, you know, Foucault and ideas of social control. Technologists aren't typically. They really don't care that much about surveillance. So for them, the work fails both on kind of its rhetorical level, but also on the idea of what's even important in it. So when you see people who are working on surveillance technologies, typically they don't find surveillance spooky. You know, they don't find it unsettling. They don't really mind the idea of social control. And so this is kind of the schism that right now in our culture, we have, you know, a couple of classes of people trained by education to think certain ways, scientists and engineers, and they more or less have the right to make technology. They are given the resources, the distribution, the authority within culture to make technology. Now, that wasn't always the case. I mean, technologies often have been made by workers, for instance, and so Marxist labor historians do really great jobs of showing that a lot of really important ideas in, say, you know, 19th century industrial processes came from workers, not necessarily from a separate class that were trained to make technologies. So a lot of what we're trying to do in the Computing Culture group is to go back and try to understand what is the subculture of science and engineering, and what technologies are they not building just because they wouldn't find them interesting? And then we try to go ahead and build those technologies. So we're not really, you know, building technologies so much for expression, although that's an important point. We're not building them to make a point, although that is, of course, very important. All of our technologies do operate on some kind of rhetorical level. But more importantly, we're building technologies that actually work as, you know, proofs of concept, as prototypes for a world that we would rather be kind of living in, or, as you'll see, for a world that we would absolutely not want to be living in. So So we kind of go in both dimensions, either building technologies ahead of DARPA that we wouldn't want to see exist, or building ones that are never going to get built in any other way. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do. Part of the point of this intervention, Langdon Winter said it really well, where Langdon Winter's an STS guy working at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he, for many, many years, has been kind of an ethical voice about technologies. He talks about how technologies come to us as black boxes, as kind of fully formed things which we can't really open up. We can't do critiques of technology as well as we can do critiques of, say, a text. So in universities around the country, we have many, many people who are trained to look at texts, to analyze them, to understand them, to deconstruct them. Relatively few people look at technologies on the same level. And so Winter made a point. He was often called something of a Luddite, because he was always saying, wait a minute, do we need to be going down the technological path that we're going down? Wait a minute, is there an ethical component to this technology? And people said, oh, he's just a Luddite. He's just throwing himself on the machine to stop production. And the argument against Winter and other people like him was always, if you stop doing new technologies, you're going to be stuck with the status quo. And Winter has this great response, which is, yeah, but if we keep building technologies without thinking about why we're building them, we're embodying the status quo in physical material reality for the next generation. And so his point is that you have just as much status quo if you continue to build without thinking. So finding that kind of that third way of mindful, what Phil Agre calls critical technical practice, is part of a strategy that myself and a few other people are involved in. So this is the work from back around 1992. At that point, Slovenia had seceded from Croatia, from Yugoslavia. Croatia was going to follow, and anyone who knew anything about that area of the world, an area that my family's from, knew that there was going to be a big war. That there was going to be a big and very dirty war. And it was really interesting because at the time, the U.S. government, the previous administration, Lawrence Eagleburger, had been a major investor. I think Kissinger was also a major investor in the Yugo, this Yugoslavian car. And there were a lot of reasons why the US government wasn't that interested in intervening and preventing a war. But what became clear to me as the political kind of process unfolded was that we didn't really have any technologies like government or technologies like international organizations for preventing war. What we had was things like the UN or the UNPRO-4, which are there to prevent crimes against humanity, and they actually go in and fight once a war has started. But there wasn't any kind of interesting way of trying to tease out the problem about how do you prevent Serbia from trying to retake these areas, or how do you try to negotiate peace without the possibility of war breaking out. I thought that was really funny, and so this is kind of early in my career. I was still an undergraduate in the Art Institute of Chicago, and I was like, well, maybe I could build a technology. That's what we do in our culture. We build technologies to solve problems. Your teeth are brown, build a technology. So I thought, okay, maybe I can build a technology. So this is it. It's called Hunter Hunter, and it has 3 microphones, and sound takes time to travel. So if you have 3 microphones and you make a sound over here, it hits the microphones at different points. And with that, you can tell exactly where in 3D space the sound is coming from. So that was the first step. Second, if the sound was fairly loud, it would sample the audio, pull it kind of out, make a digital recording of the audio. And then it would extract the attack, sustain, and decay of the sound to, if I clap, you hear the initial sound, and then it gradually kind of fades out. And then it would pass that shape through a pattern recognition system called a neural network. And the pattern recognition system would go and analyze whether or not the sound was a clap, a slap of metal together, or in fact a gunshot. And if it was a gunshot, then this is the inner city option. It would aim this small 9mm cannon exactly in the direction where the gunshot had come from, and then fire a bullet in that direction. So the idea of it was sort of Hammurabi's eye for an eye. It was a little technological instantiation of a moral principle that if you enact violence, violence will be enacted on you. And so the idea was that you could drop these by parachute all over Yugoslavia, and maybe game parks in Kenya, or in fact the neighborhood in the south side of Chicago where I was living, and it would prevent deaths by gun violence unless someone had been working on it first. And this was part of a series I did called Tools for a Dystopian Future. I was coming out of a product design background. I had never really thought of being an artist. But in product design, I had been there for a couple of years, working for some really interesting kind of proto.coms in the early 90s, late 80s. And I realized that, working with these Fortune 50 companies that I was employed by, that the chance of producing a really interesting technology was directly inverted to the chance of the technology actually getting out in public. And I had tried in my role as a product designer several times to produce technologies that I thought had some ethical advantage over the rest of the market or something like this. And in fact, the chance of that actually getting out in a product were really reduced compared to another product that, say, was smaller or lighter or cost less to produce. So I began to notice that both with engineering and product design, that relationship that you're trying to do something that's innovative and ethical, you can do that in very small limited runs. And so if you're a good product designer, you're actually accountable to this whole system. And so I'd actually gone back to art school because I thought, well, that's the place where I can be the least accountable to anyone. It's like the most irresponsible role you can take in contemporary society. But the problem with art school is that there's very little technical education. So I was largely teaching myself how to do machining. This is it, kind of looking around the gallery at people walking by. They would walk really gingerly. So my machining is crap. My electronics were pretty bad. The thing couldn't even last, like for the length of a 4-week installation. But I was actually doing it on my own. I was teaching myself assembler, microcontrollers, things like that, in an environment largely outside of classes. And it's really great with my contemporary grad students because now that we're at MIT, they can do everything about 10 times faster than I could have. And that's such an exciting thing. Resources are really important in this kind of work. And having kind of basic tools and getting enough engineering to be able to instantiate things technologically. Of course, the problem with Hunter x Hunter was that after I had done this, about a year later, I was watching TV. CNN has these little technology next 5 minutes, and one of the reports came on, and it was about a company in Oakland, kind of a high crime area of Oakland, and this company had been hired by the city to put up microphones like every city block so that they could triangulate gunshots. And I thought that was amazing. It was not long after I'd had my idea, and I thought my idea was so dystopic, right? But here they were doing it in Oakland. The one advantage of my system is in Oakland they would send a fat cop out to shoot you. And I thought, well, at least I've eliminated the middleman, But it became clear to me, and Jeff Batchen told me this in grad school, he said, you're not going to produce anything stranger than what science is already producing. And I realized at that point that I needed to understand a lot more about science and a lot more about kind of the history of engineering. And if I wasn't going to have my work trumped by some startup with a lot more money than me, often before I even get the piece out, I would have to understand the systems that I was essentially in competition with much better. So I started doing historical work, and I showed Hunter x Hunter in Helsinki, and someone said, oh, if you're interested in history of technology, you should really go to Tallinn, Estonia, because there's a great medical museum there. And I went, and I found some old research, some old equipment from research that was phenomenal. It just blew my mind. And I went back to the US and started looking at history of technology and ended up going to a couple museums. And I started, for a couple of years, doing kind of reanimations of old experiments which were sort of dried branches on the tree of science and technology evolution. So some area that someone was doing really great research in, but in fact, they hadn't actually gotten out in contemporary science or technology. Other ideas had become more ascendant. So this is an example. This is a technology by a group called American Hydropower Institute, which was a sort of consortium of hydropower companies in the American Southwest. And these companies, they were building dams. The problem is when you build a dam, you flood all the valleys behind the dam. And in this case, the dam was going to cause the extinction of a species of ant that only lived in that part of Arizona, Ormiga micronica, I think was the name. So a very small ant. And the Endangered Species Act had just been passed. So Congress was saying, no, you can't build the dam. So they decided, well, what if we can ensure to the US government, the EPA, which was a fairly new institution at that point, what if we can ensure that we'll keep the ant alive in perpetuity in an artificial environment? And the government said, well, keep talking. So this was the result of the research. It's this robot, and it lives with a colony of ants, and it essentially replaces the technology of governance by measuring the ants, looking at their population, doing the equivalent of census by dropping food like we do in Central Asia. Drop food onto the surface, and the ants would come, eat the food. Hey, then they would absorb the food at different rates, depending on how many there were. And a very simple vision system. It had to be a white background because this is the 1970s, and vision systems weren't very good at the time. A very simple vision system would look at kind of the density of the ants, make judgments, and at this point, this was I think 1974. At this point, one of the biggest ethologists in the 20th century, a guy named E.O. Wilson, who is a mermologist who studied ants, he had these equations which he said were true for species no matter where they lived. And it was a very simple one. If you look at a European carpenter ant, whether it's in Poland or France or the Ukraine or wherever, they will always have the same amount of caloric input to how many ants get killed. So where the carpenter ant can live has to be in a microclimate where the same number of kind of seeds are on the ground that the ant can eat in relation to the same, the number of sparrows that are eating the ant. So there's this predator-prey ratio that E.O. Wilson said was constant for species. So this was modeled in the robot. So it had, both the technology for shaking food out and feeding the ants, but then at exactly the ratio that sparrows would do, it would also pair the population. So there was this very bright light up there in a magnifying glass, and it would occasionally, pair the ants. And so this was their system, and they built it in this great kind of geodesic structure that was, constantly heated. And there was this video that went along with it in which these hippies are protesting outside of a power plant saying, save the ants, down with progress, sort of Hollywood hippies. And then this kind of warm, gray-haired industry representative comes up and says, no, we're trying to help the ants, not hurt them. This is a machine for living. I wish my mother-in-law had a place to retire that was this comfortable. And in the end, the hippies understand that, technological progress is good. And the installation, as I recreated it, was had both the promotional video on some sides, and then also this kind of moving interactive software that was a representation of what the robot was doing at the moment. And it looks like that ant is soon to go. When I was presenting and saw this medical museum in Tallinn, Estonia, I came across this research which was really remarkable research because it had this very unique relationship to research that was happening in the US at the time. This is an example. So on the left is a scientist named Ilya Prokopov who was reproducing some experiments that were coming out of the US in the early 1960s, late 1950s. This is a period in science. There was a kind of a movement called cybernetics. How many of you are familiar with cybernetics? Just a little, yeah. Okay. So Norbert Wiener and a couple of other people had decided that they were building now technologies. Essentially, Wiener was in the army. He was working with systems to help people shoot down German planes. Basically his approach was that people weren't smart enough to do the calculation, or they weren't used to doing a calculation when you fire bullets. By the time they reach the plane's somewhere else. So you actually have to fire ahead of the plane, and it's not an easy thing. People weren't trained on video games at that point. So soldiers didn't know how to do it. So he would build mechanical systems which would watch the speed at which someone was following the plane, guess by that how far the plane was away, and then move the gun based on that. And this was a system where essentially it was a machine that was sensing information, making some kind of decision, and then outputting physically in the world. And what Wiener was struck by when he first had this was that occasionally the machine would work, in which case it would look kind of like an arm moving, and it was really uncanny. No one had ever done this before. The only other servo mechanism that had ever like become famous was the toilet. So he was looking at that, and occasionally if you got the equation wrong, it would sort of palsy. It would overshoot, or it would do things that you might see in, it looked like something that humans would do. And Wiener became very interested in the idea of communication and control, and how biology and technology could inform each other. And so he started this kind of movement called cybernetics. And one of the, a couple people were working specifically in how nerves communicate. McCulloch and Pitts are very famous neurologists, which a lot of machine learning today is based on their work. But in particular, one guy named Frank Rosenblatt was working on modeling neurons to come up with a better kind of computer than anything anyone was thinking of. Computers in the 1940s and 50s were serial. They had a central processor. They had information like memory, and they would take the information into the central processor. It would do something really simple, and then it would output. But it was entirely based on logic and math. And what these guys were noticing is that our brains do remarkable work, remarkable computation, but not using mathematical models, but rather analog kind of, not serial, not logic-based, but analog representations. And what happens is you have two neurons, something positive happens like endorphin rushes, you shoot up, and the connections between the neurons are strengthened, and your chance of shooting up gets much higher. So they were beginning to model these analog systems of neurons, and they came up with these things called perceptrons, or what are now called neural networks. And they're essentially analog little computers that can take some input in, analog input, make connections to other ones like them, and then make some kind of an output. And Rosenblatt, you can still see his work on Nova every once in a while, those of you who watch PBS. And it's like this great 1950s documentary where this British announcer is saying, Rosenblatt's work successfully reproduces the human brain. It's an amazing system. And what he's done with it is, reproduced our ability to recognize gender in people that we're talking to. And so basically, he came up with a system that had light inputs, and you could present an image of a face to this system, and it would output whether they were male or female based on the image of the face. And so he was doing this in the 1950s. Really interesting, really promising research. But in 1963, one of my colleagues, Marvin Minsky at MIT, and a guy named Seymour Papert, they wrote a book called Perceptrons, which proved that these things didn't work. And so in the US, research stopped in neural networks for about 20 years. It didn't start again until the 1980s. And so there was this 20-year period where, based on this one book and a very convincing set of arguments by people who were going for DARPA funding, they managed to divert almost all of the funding towards symbolic logic and mathematical-based artificial intelligence. And it's very interesting. It's still something that rankles a lot of people, because in fact these things work very, very well. The book was kind of wrong. They oversimplified the problem. I can't say that to Marvin. He's tenured, but anyway, that's kind of the way most people historically interpret it. So this Russian guy, Ilya Prokopov, he was doing research in the University of Moscow, and he didn't have enough money to buy the Minsky book, and so he didn't know that the science was wrong. And he continued to do the work in isolation in the Soviet Union. And by the mid-1960s, he had managed to develop a system which had far, far more neuronal elements than Rosenblatt's did. But he found that he could output this analog wave. If it was a female face, it would be high. If it was a male face, it would be low. But consistently on that analog wave, there was a little bump. And he couldn't figure out what the bump was. It was there for some men and some women, but not all men, not all women. If the wave was going low for male, the bump would be in the same place. And so it was this kind of subharmonic on the main partial, and he was trying to figure out what does that represent. And first he thought, well, let's see. Are all the photographs lit the same? Could it be that? Could it be the haircut? And so he gradually, isolated all of these potentially mistriggering parameters, and none of them worked. And so he then started asking people questions, and he found that the bump was only there for members of the Communist Party. And so he became very interested, and of course his funding shot through the roof because the NKVD immediately saw the applications of this. And so his research continued to get more and more funding. He was moved to Tallinn, where I saw his work. This is the recreation I did in 1997, showed it in Chicago. And it was the first time I used people in my work, so I hired these Polish women who spoke Russian, and they would wear lab coats, and art viewers would come by unsuspecting, and she would say, "Good, you are here for study," and grab you and throw you down in the chair, at which point this machine would come and look at your face and then compare it to these faces of NKVD known criminals. The great thing in the Soviet Union at that point is 1 out of every 5 people was an informant. So you had information on what people were eating, who they were sleeping with, what music they listened to when they came home. All this incredible granularity of detail. And so when you have that big a population, he was able to train the neural network to notice these incredibly accurate things about people. So of course this is a fiction. This piece and the piece with the ants are both kind of historical fictions that I started doing after I was doing the futurist technologies. So I would research some particular moment in science and engineering, find something that could have almost been built, and then go ahead and build that. And so I would kind of put a new bud on the end of this tree that had dried up. So the stuff about Rosenblatt doing the gender stuff is real. The stuff about Prokopov isn't. I didn't mean to deceive people, but it's so easy. Stanley Milgram pointed this out some time ago. It's so easy if you have some technology, people will just start believing it. And I was presenting these in art venues. I made no claims about them really, any more than Edith Wharton does in a novel, but the credulity was so great that I was completely unprepared for it in most cases. Like when I showed the ant piece, I was in one of the videos, and no one really spotted that because they just, they saw the crazy glasses and the mad scientist, and I guess I was convincing. But I asked the Finns, why did you believe it? Some of my friends saw it and they believed it, and I said it was so clearly over the top. I thought, why did you believe it? And they said, well, we'll believe anything from the U.S. So this is work that I would do as historical fictions, but you can actually, I think most of them have been taken off by now, but on the internet for about a period of 2 or 3 years, there were a bunch of histories of technology where you would actually see this stuff inserted. And one time the Deutsches Hygienisches Museum in Dresden actually wanted to show my work, and we went through the whole process of the contract, and then they sent me a letter, and I realized that they didn't know that they were fictions, and I didn't want to get them fired. So. This is the last piece that I did in these kind of historical series called Natural Language Processor. And this one is about sort of the relationship of language and enculturation and biology. And this is a question that basically in all of these 3 pieces, these historical fictions, I take an issue which is a pan-historical scientific issue. So the thing about human faces is something that has come up many times. Most of you are familiar with what's considered really bad science like phrenology and cranioscopy. These are universally held up as examples of bad science. In fact, if you look at the history, it's a very, very complicated set of issues in those sciences. One of the reasons that phrenology essentially is the study of the bumps on your head, because if the brain in fact has areas that do certain things, which we now believe in again. For a long period of time, people didn't believe in it. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was pretty clear that if you drove a railroad spike through someone's head, at this angle, and it took out parts of the brain, they would stop being able to do certain things. And so they said, okay, let's look at all the cases, and they began to figure out that like over here, your powers of like reasoning and spatialization. So up here is kind of the important stuff. For human activity. Back here is your amativeness, which is your love power. And part of the reason they got that is because cats and apes have very strong, bonobos have very big areas back here. So even, I know people whose grandmothers would call them to their chair and feel their skull and tell them what they were going to be when they grew up. So these are fairly popular sciences, but they're discredited now. On the other hand, right now there's a huge amount of research into human faces on attraction. So for instance, all over the world, there are scientists who are studying what sorts of faces men are attracted to in women. Many, many studies like this. 1 or 2 studies about what faces women are attracted to in men. But primarily men and women. And it's a very interesting kind of science because, number one, it's largely funded by the cosmetics industry. Okay. Number 2, it goes back to Francis Galton, who was a eugenicist, a cousin of Darwin's, who was actually trying to look for the criminal face so that you could arrest people based on what they looked like. Happens all the time, but in that case, it was based on facial features and not just color. And he was very upset because when he averaged all these faces of criminals, the person looked pretty good. So it was something that frustrated him, but all these contemporary texts go back to him as proof that faces have some kind of evolutionary component in them. Right now, there's also another huge science, some of which is done in my lab, called affective computing, which is an attempt to develop emotional interactions with computers. So the computers can, for instance, tell, like the little paperclip pops up and you want to kill it, and it can read that. And so the paperclip runs away and hides or something like this. And one of the applications for this that people always talk about is to have video content that's edited in real time. So you're watching Titanic, there's supposed to be this heart-rending moment and you're kind of chuckling. And so it says, I've got a tough egg in the house. And so it automatically kind of re-edits the video based on what your reactions are. So there's all this kind of stuff. Of course, it's also being used to predict the success of marriages, to predict liars in forensic work and criminal law. So, so the science is very interesting, and it's for me, very contestable science. The work on emotions, for instance, runs on the premise that there are 6 basic universal human emotions. And as an artist, that's a little spooky, because you could imagine film reviews could just be reduced to kind of these bar graphs, over a time axis. But more importantly, if you look at the reason that they say that this is true, it's because someone went to New Guinea in the late 1960s, did some really, really bad ethnography, purported that New Guineans have less culture and civilization than we do, so they're closer to nature, so they're a good object to study. But then by the end of the book say, but look at these people, they're just like us. So they've implanted nature into us as an object of study. So it's a very kind of bizarre, sophisticated rhetorical strategy by which you can study people and claim that you're not actually studying culture or history or society or language or any of the other things that we care a lot about in the humanities. So one of the biggest challenges for scientists is to try to understand language, because we're so embedded in language. And in fact, no one doesn't speak language except for a few people who have really significant diseases. And so they're so far out of the norm that they don't become good objects of study. So in one after another kind of attempt, for instance, I don't know how many of you have seen the Jean-Pierre Gorin film, Poto and Kabengo. It's a really great film from the 1970s, and he's another issue. But the film is great, and it's about these 2 kids who develop their own language at home. And so right now, anywhere on the planet, if you're born deaf, mute, and a twin, scientists will descend on you from all corners of the planet and start studying you. And so that's one of the ways that you can study language, but there aren't many. So this is the installation as I set it up. It's essentially a robotic bassinet with a ground glass in which a baby lives. And images are presented to it from a slide projector. Once the slide projects the images, these machines, these gigantic tape drives, record what the baby says in response. So they'll record what the baby says based on the image. And at that point, you present an image of a banana, the baby makes a noise, you have an idea that they might be talking about a banana, or yellow or something like that. And gradually the machine over the course of the day would begin to parse enough information from the conversation with the baby that it would be able to try to engage the baby in conversation. The research was eventually pulled by the Human Subject Board on campus because the children were acquiring language slower than they would have been if they weren't in the machine all day. All they know is that by the end of it, they had found something like 40 different words for milk. So those are the kind of the past. I got to Rensselaer Polytechnic, and 2 things happened. So I left grad school, started teaching in an engineering university or engineering institute in upstate New York. And for the first time, I was really confronted with not having a kind of a home. I was in an art department, but it was a very small art department, and really all the people I had to interact with all day were scientists and engineers. And I kind of realized that I was actually, for the first time, in a position where I could make technologies and get them out in the world, in a way that I had some authority now because I was teaching in an engineering school. And so I thought about, well, I've got to kind of, it makes sense for me. It's sort of my responsibility now to design technologies for the contemporary. And so I started thinking about that. And at the same time, I had been working so hard on all these historical, histories of technology that I kind of felt like, well, I need to get out of the library more. I haven't been clubbing enough. And sure enough, I figured out a way to kind of combine this kind of interest in the present. There were a lot of technologies coming out for DJs that were supposed to get rid of the problem of vinyl. And I always think that that's really interesting because there are all these technologies that are getting rid of problems like body odor that you didn't know you had until the technology came out. And one of them is, for me, vinyl. I mean, vinyl is amazing, and DJ culture is a phenomenal kind of contemporary art that was developed, in Brooklyn and the Bronx and Jamaica, and for people in Japan or California to be designing these technologies, saying there's something wrong with your art, seems like a really interesting premise to me. And I thought, well, what if I were to say that what if I can't really do something better than DJing because it's a complete artwork. It's like violin concertos, 300, 400 years ago. It's perfect. It's the perfect representation of the culture they come from. There's nothing wrong with that art. So I can't really do something better for DJs, but I could make a different mistake than what everyone else was making and say the problem isn't the vinyl, it's the DJs. And so this was the DJI Robot sound system, which is kind of this extended project that went on and on and on for since about 1999, 2000. And so the goal of the project was to develop the first fully robotic kind of DJ. It should be able to scratch, slice, cut, mix, and compete with human DJs. And of course, this issue about the problem being the person is not a new issue. One of American labor history's most famous songs is the Ballad of John Henry. I don't know how many of you know about him, but he was a freed slave who was working for the B&O Railroad. And in the 19th century, there was a very common kind of marketing ploy for selling steam-powered devices. And that was to bring a steam-powered device into a village and challenge the strongest man or the strongest ox to a competition. And if in fact the machine won, then you could say, see, the machine is better than a person here. And of course, they would manage to hide all the labor that went into the machine, the factory where people were putting it together, the people who were cutting down the timber or extracting the coal from the ground to power the machine, all these, the mechanics who fixed it. So part of the way that machines and technology work is by hiding human labor in a way that you don't really notice the work that's going on. I don't know how many of you read The Last Harpers, but according to one of the articles there, in the US right now, it takes 2 calories of gasoline to produce 1 calorie of food. I mean, that's phenomenal. That's the green revolution in a nutshell, where we've got entire foreign policy devoted to getting oil so that we can produce food more efficiently, and heat up the planet. So anyway, it's kind of an old kind of marketing strategy to hide this labor. In the case of John Henry, if you read the lyrics, he was challenged. He actually beat the machine, but he exerted himself so much in the process that his entrails spilled to the ground and he lay down dead. Isn't that a good kind of moral for labor? So in this case, I thought I would reproduce the John Henry kind of experiment by challenging DJs to a competition, and hopefully killing them in the process. And it was a little bit restaging the Deep Blue controversy. The idea was to take it to the DMC competition. This is some text that I pulled off of the site of the guy who's doing kind of the premier checkers application in the world. To beat the best players in real-time performance by combining science and engineering to build high-performance systems. This is kind of the system. I'll show some video in a second, basically a lot of people say, why would you do this? And I can only turn to my art and technology betters like Stellark, who says the body is obsolete, and say that this is a system that can DJ in environments that are too harsh for human conditions. Of course, Chernobyl, but. So our research continues. As of a couple of years ago, we were building the system to listen to a DJ and then be able to reproduce their set in real time. So this is an example. This is Andy Wong, one of the researchers in my group, who developed a system called Soul Stealer, where he was essentially, let's see if we have audio. This is him whistling into a microphone. And then this is the system about 5 seconds later scratching it. And the warbling is because it was a warbled tone to begin with. So it was kind of a perfect system. And so DJ could do a variety of scratches. We could do fast Fourier transformations on the data and output a similar scratch using a proportional integral derivative motor control loop. So anyway, of course, that was great, and I got to go around, live the style of the, international DJ in really kind of not too important venues. But it was a great lifestyle for a while. But then September 11th happened, and of course, nothing will ever be the same again, right? So I felt, I'd just come to MIT, and all of a sudden I was in this place with like much more kind of institutional authority than RPI, and within weeks of being there, people would invite me to give talks at universities who had never seen any of my work, and I thought, wow, I have such a responsibility being here. I'm speaking in a way for the entire enterprise of science and technology. On the other hand, MIT, something like 85% of the funding comes from defense, right? The third largest cost object after research and faculty is Lincoln Labs, which is a defense lab that no one's ever, been inside of. That's only one of several defense labs, around MIT. And, here I'm doing Defense Advanced Research Project, DARPA quad charts while I'm there. So I was like, somehow I don't feel comfortable being at MIT unless I'm addressing something of what's going on. And in October 2001, I was looking at the speed at which the US was going to war. And it really bothered me. I mean, I was like, that afternoon on September 11th, I was flipping channels, in a hotel in Cambridge and just looking for some TV station that seemed to have some degree of mindfulness about what was going on. And I just couldn't find it. And I'm flipping. And finally, I come across one and there's this teenager crying. And she says, I'm just really worried about what the US is going to do. I'm really worried that they're going to overreact and it's going to change the US and the whole world in a negative way. We call her crazy. So I'm like, wow, what channel is this? This is the first thing I've seen in like an hour of flipping, and sure enough, it was Canadian Broadcasting. So, I realized I had to do something about this and the speed at which the U.S. was going to war, because I understood that within a few days after 9/11, there was legislation which ended up getting passed in Congress, mandating that there be a lot of money put into facial recognition systems. And this was an area that I'd just been doing a lot of research in. And I knew that facial recognition systems are awful. They're terrible. They don't work very well. They have lots of false positives. They have like even more false negatives. So there's all these ways in which that was probably not the best legislation to pass. And so I realized that a lot of the reason we were going to war so quickly was just this issue that there's a huge amount of money and energy pushing the government towards that. I mean, you spend all this money on defense, you're not going to not use it. It's like having a Ferrari in your driveway. So what's what was I going to do? I was going to try to figure out a system to keep the U.S. from going to war. And so to do that, I had to act like a good engineer and analyze the problem. And the problem, to me, one of the main problems was that we got out of the war in Vietnam largely because of the attempts to bring the war home, both in the media and Martha Rossler and other people like that. So because of the images of war in people's living rooms, Americans are pretty good people. They didn't approve of what the government was doing, and so they forced a change from the inside. Now, lots of activists noticed this. The Pentagon really noticed it. And for the last, 20, 25 years, they've been working on doing nothing but preventing Americans from seeing what happens in war. So in for instance, Grenada, one of our moments of pride, when journalists were flying there, they forced their airplane down. In the first Gulf War, there was the press pool system. And what I realized is that in the Gulf War, both the one, the first and the one now, the other side was much less worried about journalists. But in Afghanistan, the Taliban absolutely didn't want journalists either. So I realized that this was going to be, has anyone seen any images of the war in Afghanistan when it was happening? Like on the New York Times, there'd be an image of a Northern Alliance soldier with some smoke trails in the back, and they would say, U.S. bombing happens. Have you seen video?
I haven't seen video, but
okay. Yeah, so it's it was completely closed down, and I was worried that would happen. I was worried it would make it possible to get into another war soon after. Call me crazy. So I decided that I would try to solve this again with the technology, and I designed a war reporter that was essentially, I'll actually, why don't I show this on video? A war reporter which was a robotic war reporter. At the time, the US was saying that they weren't allowing journalists in because they were concerned about the journalist's safety. So concerned that Donald Rumsfeld said that if Americans saw a wounded journalist on the battlefield, American soldiers, they shouldn't help the journalist because that wasn't their responsibility. So they were very concerned about American journalist safety. In fact, everyone was concerned about American journalist safety. And so they said that there was no way to allow journalists in. Let me just go with this audio for a moment.
October, the American public has seen very little battlefield footage and has heard and read very few reports about combat or casualties that did not first pass through Pentagon gatekeepers. Chris Csikszentmihalyi is director of the computer.
So basically what I did is I came up with this war reporting system, and Matt Mirapol had wanted to do a story for the New York Times on the robot DJ, and I said, well, that project's kind of over. But I'm working on something new. And he was like, oh, what is it? And I told him, and he was like, how long have you been working on this? I'd had the idea like 3 days before. I said, oh, some time. Yeah, we're getting close to being done. And so he said, do you have a website? And I was like, yeah, we haven't made it public yet, but I can put it up. And so that night I worked like crazy and came up with this website. And so, even though I'm not Dalton Conley, it ended up in the New York Times the next day. And basically, I had to start building the thing then, which is a really long process. This is about halfway. We're first doing our laptop-based, moving. Of course, we finished it about two months after the war ended. So we've got the project mothballed right now for Korea or wherever, somewhere on the axis. And anyway, so the idea is it would have this became kind of a media intervention. I mean, kind of sort of a media intervention. Even though I had really wanted to build the robot, we didn't get to deploy it in time. But the fun of it was the actual media coverage, where you'd be talking to journalists and I sort of channeled Noam Chomsky while I was doing these interviews. I paid a lot of attention to how he does his interviews. And this kind of famous thing where you have a set of talking points that you want to deal with. And one of the talking points was the Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, which at that point were being retrofitted with Hellfire missiles. And so these planes that don't have a pilot that are flying around giving really low resolution video. I mean, buildings, you saw Colin Powell a year ago. The buildings are like this big on the image. And then they're making decisions whether to kill people. So, I mean, a very famous case was this one where they followed 3 people in a pickup truck who parked near a former Taliban training camp, and they noticed that one of the people was unusually tall. And so they killed them and sent in soldiers to get their DNA to see if they were related to the House of Saud. And sure enough, they weren't. They were just getting scrap metal from the American bombing. But I thought that's really interesting. That's a kind of profiling I've never heard of before. Kill them because they're tall. So I wanted to get out on the media talking as much about this relationship because, I mean, that's a media issue, a question of representation. And, the Army wasn't really thinking about it that well. This is in America's Army, the free video game that the Army released at that point. So we decided that we'd better put our image into it so that, young Americans who are being trained would get used to it, not shoot it. So going through this kind of process in the media was very educational. I can't tell you the number of kind of phone interviews I'd be doing for radio, and the journalist would say, but doesn't that take the human element out of reportage? And I'd say, you realize we're on the phone right now, don't you? This is the biggest Muslim newspaper in the biggest Muslim country in the world. So in it, I'm being quoted saying, in the U.S., we believe in cotton gloves warfare style. It's a part of our national policy that American soldiers shouldn't be killed in a war. So we're essentially coming up with a class system where one half of the fight, experiences war in kind of its real aspects of death and blood, and the other half is 17 miles away with a targeting system, and I think that's what we're doing, and I think it's easier to go back to war now, not only because the media isn't showing people what's going on, but also because soldiers are increasingly not seeing what's going on. They're not even there when the death happens, when the wedding parties are being killed by mistake. So this is a kind of a project that we're continuing. I'm actually. This was a really stupid robot. It worked rhetorically, but a single landmine would have taken it out. So we're now working on our own unmanned aerial vehicle called Freedom Flies, and it's there to do war reporting in areas, borders and areas where people aren't allowed to go. So that's sort of been a presentation of my work. Now, of course, what's coming up in the future is I'm running this research group. Been doing it for about 2 years, have some really talented graduate students, and hopefully I'll have more talented graduate students. And what I'm trying to do is develop a site where people have access to nanotechnology, to quantum computing, to all the things that are happening at the Media Lab, and kind of envision these from the get-go at a very basic level in a different way than they're being envisioned typically. And so I'll just show. Let me show one more project that's been happening since that point. This is a project called Government Information Awareness, and this was our kind of second response to contemporary American politics. How many of you know about a government project called Total Information Awareness? Okay, that's good. That's actually a lot. I love Manhattan. This is a project that is a DARPA hard project. So it was getting about $500 million a year minimum. Like what they accounted was $5 million a year. And this is a project to spy on everyone in the entire world all the time, to monitor all of their electronic transactions, all of their financial transactions. It was very interesting. One of the lucky things for us is that it was, basically the Bush administration was like, who can we hire to do really good science? And they came across Admiral Poindexter, the only known felon from Iran-Contra who was pardoned. Obviously, he doesn't have much of a military future. His political future is bust. So, where can he go but science? So he was called on by the administration to run this incredibly expensive project. Luckily, he turned out to be such a lightning rod that it's been discontinued, partly because of our work, partly because of that. But it was very interesting, when you look at the kind of Friends of the Court, when the Senate was talking about whether or not to end funding, it was almost entirely computer science departments who were defending this project because they realized, this is so impossible. This can keep us going for 20, 25 years, I mean, this is like, such a goal, a holy grail to be able to like find out what's relevant from everything, So it was all these computer science departments saying, we want in on it. These are some of the images from Total Information Awareness. This is their first logo, which they were forced to take down from the internet. Science is power. I agree completely. This is another image from their early website. That's a runner, and she's having her medical, her travel, her education, her communications, her veterinary records. I don't know what that's about. And then it's fed into this cylinder. And then her quotient of terror comes out of the bottom. And this is what TIA was doing. And so my student, Ryan McKinley, he kind of looked at them. He made friends. He's a really good programmer. And so he made friends with some very interesting people who were actually working for TIA, some computer scientists, and figured out some of how they did their structure. This is still their stuff. And he came up with an alternative. And basically, his premise was to take the intelligence of the American people, and everyone has a neighbor, a pharmacist, a postman, and so if you could get all of those people able to inform on government officials, we would be able to have the resolution of information on government officials that they would have on us. And so this is Open Government Information Awareness. And he came up with this idea November, a year and several months ago. And he said, I want to do something to really, kind of help torpedo TIA, because whether or not it's not going to come up as a good index for terror. We know that ahead of time because we've seen lots of projects like it. But it is going to be a great way for the government to have all sorts of information like COINTELPRO on people and reduce civil liberties. So he said, I want to do something about this. And the great thing about the Media Lab is you actually can. So he goes in there, he works with all these people, does all this programming, and comes up with a system called OpenGov. And basically it does a couple things, like it watches C-SPAN and C-SPAN 2 because of course they're too boring to watch by a human. So as these are going on, it's going through the closed captioning, and it does, it takes photos of the people's faces so that you can spot them at airports later, and then correlates it into a database. So it's constantly gathering stuff, which you can then also take a look against the congressional record, because something I didn't know before the project, in the congressional record, which is kind of the one record of what happens other than C-SPAN tapes, Sonny Bono can stand up. Well, not anymore, but he could stand up, and for like the Millennium Copyright Act, he would say, they would call on him, he would testify, and his testimony would be, I would like to reserve the right to change my testimony in the printed record. And the Senate chair will say, okay, and then he'll sit back down. And then his aides will write like 5 or 6 pages of pithy prose, with Michael Eisner talking in one ear. And so this is kind of the process of how the congressional record gets built. So now you can correlate that. But also you're building up this facial database. It also has alerts that run on your desktop to let you know when someone's talking, and so you can bring in a real-time stream. This is kind of how the vision system works. It looks for incidents of motion, just like a good killing robot would. So this is an example of the database that's built up. There are some mistakes. It's constantly making mistakes, misspellings and things like that. But he goes through a lot of kind of text systems that fix those mistakes. This is an example of the kind of information that you get to when you follow one of the links of a politician. So he built robots that crawl through all sorts of NGOs and watchdog groups and get the information. One of the points of it is that it should allow the chemist of Antonin Scalia to be able to say what medication, or Rush Limbaugh to say what medications he's on, but you don't want to do that by putting your name on. So you can log in anonymously. Every piece of information has a source and a contributor. In some cases, like if I see something in the New York Times, write it, I'll be the source and I'll be the contributor. The source will be the New York Times. So you can watch people who are anonymous, but they build up credibility in the same way that eBay builds up credibility for purchases and things like that. You can very quickly kind of go through political space, finding connections, looking for conspiracies. And in fact, one of the best things, we launched it July 4th of last year. Our server got crushed. We added a server a day for 6 days. We were getting something like 10 million hits a week and an email every 7 seconds. The emails are priceless. Ryan's thesis is online. Things like, because of your activism, you may be targeted for elimination using directed energy, a microchip convertible cost. So we have many, many emails like this. But within about 40 minutes, within about 3.5 hours, we had George Tenet's home address. We had the entire Department of Justice's internal phone book. So all sorts of really good information. At which point, we talked to some people at MIT, and we brought that part of the site down because we realized we couldn't legally defend the anonymity of any of the people submitting information. So Ryan is in California in a huge bus, the Freedom Bus, hacking away on a P2P version of it that would live internationally and be able to kind of protect people's identity. So these are some of the, there's no mention of Governor Bob Weiss, this wife-cheating graduate of the Bill Clinton School of Ethics. So anyway, Ryan, within 9 months had built this technical system and was in fact on CNN, on Fox, meeting with Wes Boyd from MoveOn, kind of doing all those things just 9 months after having the idea. So that's working in the present is working really well for us right now. Let me show a final thing. Oh wow, perfect. I'm just about 2 minutes over. And this is kind of a little video showing the most recent research from the fall of what's happening in the group of all the different people. I should say, again, what we're trying to look at is what the success of science and engineering have occluded and what technologies aren't being built in that shadow. My own work has been focused a lot on kind of, the politics of science, and I've talked a lot about that. But in fact, a lot of what science and engineering miss are the poetics of life. The specificity, not the generality, the moment, the subjectivity, not the empiricism. And so several of the students in my group are working on kind of more poetic technologies that look a little bit more like what you would typically consider new media art to be. So the video starts out with a couple of things. One in particular, Kelly Dobson has been trying to understand the subtle relationship between technology and emotions, not in trying to analyze emotions, but rather trying to understand why we might love our car or something like that. And so she's been doing a variety of systems which she's calling machine therapy, where she sits people down with machines and tries to get them to empathize with each other and find kind of resonances. And so this is an example of a machine therapy session underway with an old mortar and pestle, automatic mortar and pestle. It's a kind of a Sisyphusian device that just only achieves release when you remove it from its task, at which point it becomes very kind of interested. So this is kind of the source from which she's doing it. Saoirse Higgins, who was sitting next to her in that previous shot, and Simon Schiessel have been doing work. Well, they were doing work during the lead up to the war in Iraq. In this case, they did a set of pieces that were based on New York Times headlines. In this case, Bush beats drum for war. And so you'd have this little free-floating toy on a pedestal. You could pick it up, take it across the gallery. But if you wound it, all of a sudden these bomb bay doors would open next to you and start dropping. And kids loved it. And in fact, Fisher Price is a sponsor of the lab, and they loved it too. This is Simon Schiessel, former employee of Rhizome, and now he's with us. And he did this project called Haptic Opposition. He was looking at the fact that all engineers are trying to essentially make computers more compliant, more kind of quiet. They're supposed to be seen and not heard. You're supposed to be able to get information quickly from them. And so a variety of people like VNS Matrix and other artists have worked on kind of unfriendly interfaces. In this case, in Simon's, it's trying to tell you something. But if you start struggling with it, it'll tell you different things and eventually give up its assembler code. But it has this incredibly powerful motor underneath it. So it's really fighting, and it's actually stronger than you are. So eventually, Like most technologies, it'll win. That's his girlfriend. She's okay. So this is haptic opposition. Tad Hirsch is working more on the kind of activist side, and he's noticed, as many people in sociology have, that levels of pollution and fatality are much higher in poor neighborhoods than in rich neighborhoods. So he's trying to come up with a system that can do very, very inexpensive environmental monitoring of sound pollution, gas pollution, things like that. Typically, neighborhoods don't have access to that because it's an incredibly expensive process to be able to defend it legally. But if you have many distributed sensors, they can be made much cheaper, and you essentially average their outputs and come up with as statistically significant as an expensive technology. And so this is some of his work. He's going to be continuing this along with some surveillance projects through in his PhD. He's going to be trying to build surveillance models, kind of looking at the Black Panthers and how in many cases in a community, the police aren't serving your interests, and how can a surveillance system work? And this is, of course, the results of Ryan McKinley's project, a few, 9 months after he started it.
In the post-9/11 world, the U.S. government has more power to monitor the activity of Americans, but now citizens may have a monitoring service of their own. Ryan McKinley, a graduate student at MIT, has created an internet database that may help consumers keep tabs on government activity. He's our Maverick of the morning. Ryan, it's good to talk to you.
Graham, could you up it a little bit?
What exactly have you set up here?
Well, it's a system that has sort of two key parts. I've written a lot of parsers that get existing sources, so lots of public documentation, and then I'm working on ways for citizens to add more information to that, so that we can really harness the collective knowledge of the American citizen.
It can be very invasive of the privacy of government officials. Aren't you concerned about doing to government officials what you're concerned they may be doing to others?
We live in a world where lots of personal information is traded about us daily. Credit card numbers or financial histories. And so if it's legal to sell it kind of secretly behind us, it feels like it must be legal to share it publicly.
Hey, did you get a grade for this project yet?
I'm trying to graduate with this project.
The Total Information Awareness Program, or TIA. But some folks at MIT think that it's not A-OK.
That's right. Just like the internet or cable television, this system requires a mature audience. We have to be aware of who enters the information.
I understand your leeriness about having the government, in this time of terror, look through so many people's information. So you've come up with this new website where you're inviting anybody with fingers and a keyboard to type in and essentially tattle on politicians, right? It just seems like this is a perfect opportunity for somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician who's just simply trying to do their job. Somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician.
What's happening? I don't know.
Trying to do their job. Somebody with an axe to grind to sandbag a politician who's just simply trying to do their job.
I'm looking at this more as a process, as a way to sort of give us a hope of maintaining a democracy as the technologies we're developing are building a very dangerous, asymmetric balance of power.
Okay, that's it. Thanks so much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, answers, discussion, commentary. And then we have to vacate the room. So please keep your questions brief, and I'll set an example. So Chris, you talked about the artist as the most irresponsible person in society, but clearly you feel as an artist that you have a great responsibility. Perhaps it's to reverse the asymmetry of the way in which technologies, in particular media technologies, play in society. You are, at the same time, kind of a rascal in the house of technology. And when you make your work, you have many audiences, people like us, but also, and there may be some people like your colleagues at MIT in this room, but I'm wondering, how do you see your responsibility to change the way that your colleagues at MIT, scientists and engineers, relate to technology?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure, to be honest, that I can... I'm trying to change some things within the Media Lab itself, which was founded as a kind of an art and technology lab, but very soon after the initial faculty were hired, basically in 1985. Not a single other artist or musician was hired from that original faculty. So it went from about 7 people to 33 people, all of them scientists and engineers. So the Media Lab was based on a premise of having art in the building, but it's my office is in a performance space that they turned into office blocks. So so that kind of fell out of the Media Lab at some point. And so I'm trying to change within there. Within engineering culture as a whole, I'm trying to do 2 things. I'm trying to seduce young engineers with the idea that they can work on, sexy projects that aren't the kinds that they normally would. So, for instance, when I hire undergraduate researchers, like juniors or seniors in MIT, every single one that I've hired so far, if they're not in the School of Architecture, so that's 4/5 of them, have worked on DARPA or NSF-sponsored stuff. If you're, say, an Aeroastro, the fast new planes they're all military technologies. So that's the sexy problem to be working on. And so part of what I'm trying to do is, by teaching in engineering schools, to intervene early enough that people can say, oh wait, there's an alternative to developing F-15s. They're really cool. I've had a poster of an F-15 in my bedroom since I was, in the 7th grade. But maybe there's something else that can be done. So some of the fun, the rascally quality is kind of built in as a way to be seductive to young engineers. And so that's part of it. And I've corrupted a few. In terms of the overall field, I'm kind of trying to look at it from the other side too, which is to say that everyone in society has an investment in the material world around them. Something that, for instance, in the Danish legal system, there are trials for whether certain kinds of science research should be done or not. And essentially a lawyer for using, for instance, the Harvard mouse, Donna Haraway writes about this, the Harvard mouse, a mouse that has been genetically engineered so it'll develop cancer in every cell of its body by the time it's a month old. When this came to Denmark, they weren't sure if they wanted to do that. I mean, you've got this thing that's born to suffer. It has no chance of escaping that fate, and people were worried about that. And so there was a trial, and it actually went in front of the people. That doesn't happen in the US. There's very little kind of public discourse in terms of technological directions. After World War II, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a variety of other systems were put in place to have ethical components to science, but the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is over now. The clock has stopped at 7 seconds to midnight or whatever. So 7 minutes, I think. So how do we develop a kind of a public that is more able to think about technologies? And one of the problems is, if you go through a traditional humanities education, you don't have any clue. These things do come to you as closed boxes that you don't have any look into. So people like Natalie Jeremijenko or Wendy Chun or myself or Simon Penny are trying to work on ways to develop humanities-based education that includes a technical component, so that the idea of going ahead and doing some work in a technology is not that threatening. If you decide, hey, I want to run something like MoveOn, you have that option. Right now, you have to be part of the San Francisco technology scene like Wes Boyd is to do it. But it would be great if more people could get invested in that. So on one hand, you're trying to come up with these kind of rhetorics that will be attractive to engineers to think about, kind of ways for them to think about what they're doing. On the other hand, you go through and try to teach people who would normally go through humanities education some basic skills and the kind of sense that these aren't insurmountable problems. I mean, an example, in science and technology studies, I'll stop. But in science and technology studies right now, to do PhD work, you have to work in a lab, like a genetics lab. So you have someone who's never taken any science going into a genetic lab, doing maybe a year and a half of field work, and by the end being a fully functioning member of the lab. It's not impossible. So, so I think, and those people come out being able to understand science in this really remarkable way. So likewise, I think that humanities people can actually get involved in some of these issues in terms of building stuff. So that's sort of what I've been trying to work on. Good question. Yeah?
Collaborate on the project?
Yeah.
Can you name the media? Is that true? Can you name the media?
Yeah, it's totally true. I mean, I'll name the biggest one, which was BBC. They were very, very interested in the system. So, I mean, some of their journalists had been threatened by U.S. troops. So, some of their journalists had been threatened by U.S. troops, had guns pointed at them.
See, that,
so,
I found it interesting knowing that, because I work in media activism, knowing that how many of the foreign journalists were killed during the war, during the progress of the war, Spanish journalists, etc.
And that's because they weren't being embedded.
They weren't,
Yeah.
unembedded reporters are basically fair game.
Yeah.
Any independent media outlets?
Yeah, some have approached us, you know, and that's actually what we were working with actually at that point were some independent media in Iran, and because that was probably the best way for us to get it in. But nothing really came of it because we were too late. So.
Have you encountered any scientists or technologists who see your work as unhelpfully subversive? Or, you know,
Oh yeah,
you should
just
not be
one or
doing
two.
it?
You know, when I was doing the Afghan Explorer, you know, I was playing this tongue-in-cheek technologist. I mean, the interviews that, you know, if you read an interview with me, I was in character. I mean, I was pretending. I was kind of intentionally pre-post-colonial in my attitudes, and so I was often saying things that were, you know, patently offensive as a way to kind of, you know, generate more of a story. And also, you know, they weren't really that far off. I mean, I would say things like, well, you know, really it's not such an unusual thing. Engineers at my university consistently build technologies to go places that are too dangerous or too far for them to travel, like, you know, the Mars Pathfinder. You know, so of course it makes sense that, that I would be doing this. You know, one advantage is that designing for Mars is much harder than designing for Afghanistan. There's a lot of roads in Afghanistan and it's not that radioactive yet. And so the journalists would typically say, what do you mean yet? And I would say, well, we're going to use depleted uranium. You know, this causes, you know, lots of deaths in every place that we fought a war in the last, you know, 12 years from radiation poisoning. So I'd be doing that. While I was doing that, Rodney Brooks, who's the director of the MIT AI lab, a scientist who I love his science, was developing robots to go into the caves in Tora Bora to find bin Laden. And right at that point, the DARPA gave a huge kind of research initiative. They offered segways to any researcher who could train the Segway to like go a certain number of blocks, enter a building, enter a room, and identify one person in the room, you know, with a camera. So this is what Rod Brooks was working on, and you know, some of my colleagues even in the lab. So you know, the MIT administration was. They were, you know, they were watching carefully, and they continue to watch carefully. So, yeah. So, but they've been very supportive overall. I mean, I haven't felt any pressure except
Last question.
to generate money. Yeah.
I just want to ask you, when do you think there will be an alternative agency to DARPA in regards to getting that volume of money for engineering and computer science research?
I'd say maybe when a Green wins the presidential election. So, you know. I'm moving to Denmark. I don't know. It just seems impossible right now. You know, I mean, the way the country is going right now, you know, it's a level of militarism and technology that we really haven't seen since the 50s. So we're going in the wrong direction at the moment. So.
Well,